Into Britain they come by the thousands and tens of thousands. England in wartime is the land of blood, sweat, and tears. A nation blackened and battered by the fury of the Nazi Luftwaffe. But it's still England. And for young Americans on their way to war, there is much to see. Wartime Britain is a place supercharged with excitement.
World War II saw the US and UK form a very special relationship. Working together and sharing intelligence that would significantly help towards a victory. An alliance that continues to this day. But how did it all begin? To piece together how it happened, historians and experts from both sides of the Atlantic examine the course of history from their perspective. They'll take us through the breakthroughs of intelligence.
Intelligence and security that protects the West is mostly born out of this collaboration, and it's not created easily.
The challenges and obstacles along the way, and the code-breaking techniques and successes.
Perhaps the most important attribute that shaped this early relationship was patience, but patience paid off.
And a glimpse into the world of the code-breakers themselves.
It's pretty fantastic if we have a look inside.
A little collection of photos of a baseball game which took place at Bletchley. It doesn't really get much more American than baseball.
An Allied convoy plowing through the stormy, wind-swept North Atlantic. A rough passage that has Liberty ships and patrol boats wallowing in the heavy sea.
During 1941, although nominally neutral, the US Navy was increasingly involved in supporting British Atlantic convoys and was already potentially at risk from German attack.
With the turbulent ocean now calm as a mill pond, the convoy steams at top speed. For despite Hitler's threats of submarine attack, the convoys are going through.
The Battle of the Atlantic was critical for Britain's survival against the Nazi attacks. The United States was still neutral in this battle in 1941, but we were sort of neutral and a half. Because Nazi U-boats sank American ships, Franklin Roosevelt, our president, ordered U.S. Navy escorts for convoys of supplies for Britain. The U.S. would escort convoys halfway across the Atlantic. And they had orders to fire on submarines that were automatically considered hostile. As I understand it, there were no actual altercations, or at least none that rose to the level of international incidents. But the U.S., though neutral, did its best to protect the supplies that were being sent to Britain. And by arming the convoys, or that is, providing naval escorts, Franklin Roosevelt was risking war with Nazi Germany. So the United States considered the Battle of the Atlantic so critical, even before we got in the war, that we were willing to risk war itself to help Britain survive.
After a successful mission from the US to Bletchley Park, Britain and America had agreed to share intelligence. Britain began sharing information on Enigma, and the US shared expertise on Purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher machine.
I believe the patterns and agreements, even the informal ones that happened before the United States entered World War II, really created a good platform from which effective cooperation could be built as the United States became militarily involved in World War II. And we have to remember this difficulty in cooperation was worldwide. It was not just across the Atlantic. It involved a good deal of struggle and effort in the Pacific. So patience was probably the most important aspect of this early relationship.
The other thing that the British decide to do in response to the delivery of purple to Bletchley is to share the work that's been going on in Singapore with FECB on JN25. The Japanese are using pen and paper codes, book codes. Their military, their army and the navy are using a variety of book codes prior to the war. And one of these in particular is a system called JN25. This was the code name the Americans gave to it. This is the Japanese Navy's main fleet code system. So the vast majority of messages between Japanese ships and their commanders on shore are sent using this system, so it's very important. And up until this point, although the US and Britain have been working on it, they've been working on it kind of separately.
Neither side got very far. Their recoveries in this traditional code system were very few. The initial cooperation, I think, made no real difference at all in the ability to exploit Japanese Navy messages. But what it did have was promise. And the further cooperation between the British and Americans on this was extremely valuable.
At the time of the Sinkoff visit, FECB is told you can start collaborating with the Americans directly. And how that works is the team at Singapore have been gradually accumulating words for the code book and some of the additives which are used to encrypt the system. And the American team in the Philippines, a place called Station Cast, which was in Corregidor in the Philippines, they've been doing the same job in a very similar way, but because they're intercepting different messages, they have got different parts of the code book from the parts the British have got. So as soon as they start showing each other what they've done, each is able to kind of boost its knowledge of the code quite substantially. There's obviously an overlap with some of the basic stuff, but there's quite a lot of things that one team has worked out that the other team hasn't. So it really pushes both forward.
One of the important features of British and American cooperation in exploiting the Japanese mainline naval or cryptographic system that we call JN25 was the agreement on further meetings and meetings in the area.
The way it happens is there is a regular Pan Am flight from Singapore to Manila, and on the aircraft is a safe. And when each week they get the latest bits of JN25 they've been able to figure out, and the documents are placed on the aircraft and flown by the civil airliner to Manila, and then the Americans do the same on the return flight to Singapore. So all the commercial travellers on the plane would have been unaware that, down in the hold were vital secrets being exchanged.
It was not easy to affect this collaboration between the Americans and the British. It wasn't easy even across the Atlantic, and certainly it was very much more difficult across the Pacific. It generally had to be done face to face. In the early days, of course, there was the problem of just how to do it. Who was involved in what activities, sorting out the players, if you will.
How do you, even if you want to collaborate, how do you do it securely? How do you send traffic to somebody else without the Japanese, in this case, finding out? And again, while we mostly think about the war in Europe from the Bletchley point of view, the other issue with the war in the Pacific is it's a vast place. The Pacific Ocean is vast, and the US base in the Philippines, the US base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, Washington DC, Singapore, these places are all thousands of miles apart. So just simply communicating with each other is physically difficult, quite apart from any political issues that might intervene.
They would communicate by radio, each side committing to using only its top-of-the-line cryptographic system to protect any of the communications, either that involved actual Japanese systems or just the administrative aspects of affecting this cooperation. So it took time. It took a little goodwill on the parts of both sides, but eventually the sharing became really close.
But it shows that collaboration on these kinds of things wasn't straightforward. It wasn't a case of you can kind of pick up the telephone and tell them it. How you convey information from one team to another while keeping it secret is a problem that remains for the rest of the war.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it.
The Japanese surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, came as a shock both to the American public and to the military, and of course to the civilian leaders of the government. Many of the military did not believe the Japanese had the capability to do this. The public believed that the issues between our two countries were being settled by diplomacy. So it was a terrible shock when the attack came with its great loss of life, its severe destruction wreaked on American ships, and the fact the Japanese could pull it off as a complete surprise. The Americans were caught flat-footed. It was probably the most shocking event of the 20th century to the United States, both official United States and public United States. And it threw the United States into war with Japan with a passion.
However, the question remains, did SIGINT or code breaking provide any clues about what the Japanese were planning?
There are a lot of conspiracy theories about Pearl Harbor and a lot of misinformation, even in otherwise reliable histories, about the intelligence background to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
And people were very concerned that it should be as much of a surprise as people thought it was. And so before 1945, they've had something like 10 separate congressional inquiries into why they were surprised at Pearl Harbor.
There was one SIGINT exploitation going on. The Americans and the British were exploiting Japanese diplomatic communications. This was the only reliable SIGINT either country had on Japan and its policies and its intentions.
Though purple is being read, the British and the Americans are able to see what's developing amongst the Japanese. There's no really specific information about what they'll do if they go to war.
The Japanese no longer had an ambassador in Washington or London, but they had an ambassador in Berlin.
A chap called Oshima is particularly important because he's both briefing the Nazis and negotiating with the Germans about what they would do if Japan went to war, and he obtains the promise from Hitler that the Germans will join the war immediately against the US if the US declares war on Japan.
Exploiting his encrypted communications from Berlin gave Britain and the United States very close access to German military thinking, to their plans for new weapons under development, and just the milieu in which the Nazi government was operating in Germany.
So all of that is kind of in the ether, or literally in the ether, being intercepted in diplomatic messages. But the more specific question is whether it was possible to tell from code breaking whether Pearl Harbor specifically was going to be attacked.
The Japanese Navy had made a decision that it must destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, so the Americans could not intervene when the Japanese attacked, and they expected to conquer the Philippines and Southeast Asia. They proceeded to train in secret and launch their mission in secret. The Japanese military did not tell the Japanese Foreign Service what their plans were. They told the Foreign Service something like, settle Japan's grievances with the United States before the end of November 1941, or something will automatically happen. This showed up in the Japanese diplomatic communications that the Americans and British were reading, but there was no hint in the traffic itself that the Japanese were going to take this extraordinary military step. So the Americans and British had a very powerful source into Japanese policy, but it didn't cover what they really needed to know. The diplomatic service had no inkling that this attack was in the works, so there was nothing that they could inadvertently reveal in their messages that the Americans or the British could learn. The attack came as a complete surprise. Even the intelligence people were astounded.
What there was in the diplomatic messaging, there were contingency plans made with Japanese diplomats. And they actually made a special arrangement whereby if a war was going to break out, Japanese diplomats would know what the Japanese government's plans were by a coded message within Japanese news broadcasts. So it would be the normal daily news, but it would have phrases inserted into it which would clue in those in the know in the Japanese diplomatic service what was going to happen. And these are the so-called winds messages.
And the message that was sent was east wind rain. This was not a message saying we're going to attack Pearl Harbor. This was alerting Japan's worldwide diplomatic posts that it was at war with the United States.
And that was intercepted by British wireless interceptors in Hong Kong. So that information was captured by the British. And I think some US intercept stations pick it up as well. So there's a bit of a clue that something's going to happen pretty imminently, but that's a mile away from saying they knew where they were going to attack. Because Pearl Harbor isn't necessarily the most obvious place to start. An attack on the Americans in the Philippines, for example, would have been a more strategically less radical thing to do. So yes, there's a lot of circulating that suggests the Japanese are about to go to war, but it doesn't tell you what they're going to do.
The message did not mean what most people think it meant. It was a tip-off, but had no direct relation to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
And critically, at the same time, FECB in Singapore was reading some Japanese JN-25 traffic, but the Japanese are very careful to not send any naval messages that give any hint of what their fleet is doing. In fact, they do the reverse. They run quite an elaborate deception operation. One of the things you can do with wireless sets is there's a thing called operator's fist. If someone's sending Morse code, the way they tap out the dots and dashes is a bit like handwriting. Every person who uses Morse will make their dots and dashes slightly different lengths, and they will have different patterns. So if you're used to listening to Morse code, you know straight away who's sending the message because they have a sort of distinctive pattern. And both the British and the Americans were using this to track Japanese ships, because if you had a message from a certain wireless operator and you knew which ship he was on, it would tell you, where the message was coming from. The Japanese actually took the wireless operators off some of their major carriers and left them in Japan, and those guys sent messages as if they were on their ships in Japan, while the carriers themselves sailed under radio silence off to Pearl Harbor. So the British and the Americans are intercepting Japanese naval messages, but they're going, well, we think that's coming from the Akagi or whatever, one of the carriers, and it appears to be still in home waters in Japan. So signals intelligence is being obtained, but it's a deception by the Japanese. And so this is why the whole thing comes as a complete surprise, both to the British and the Americans.
As America mobilized, the Japanese tides swept over the western Pacific islands, engulfed Burma and the Malay states, and drove Britain from her vital naval stronghold of Singapore.
The Japanese invasion of Malaya is the start of a string of defeats, really, for the British in East Asia. The Japanese are able to invade Malaya and capture more or less the whole of Malaya relatively quickly. There was a defensive plan that the British had built up for protecting it, but it really didn't work very well. And very quickly the Japanese conquer the whole of Malaya and they reach Singapore. And notoriously, Singapore itself falls in February 1942. And prior to that, Singapore had been considered more or less indestructible. It was considered to be the one kind of fortress that Britain had in the Far East that could never be captured. And it was incredibly heavily fortified on its seaward side. But of course, if you've conquered Malaya already, you kind of come in through the back door. And so Singapore fell quite quickly. The problem from a signals point of view is that FECB, the British Signals Intelligence Operation, was based in Singapore. So they have to pack up rather quickly and they shift themselves from Singapore to Colombo in Sri Lanka, where there's quite a big Royal Navy presence already. And so they pack everybody off to Colombo, apart from a few people who are left in Singapore to man intercept stations and bits and pieces, and those people fall into Japanese captivity, unfortunately, very quickly. So FECB re-establishes itself in Colombo and starts intercepting Japanese naval traffic again quite quickly, although it's a bit more difficult because Sri Lanka's that much further away from the main area of Japanese operations, so the signals are harder to intercept. Meanwhile, the Japanese have plans for Sri Lanka. The Royal Navy has a fleet in the Eastern Fleet, it's called, which is their fleet for the Indian Ocean area and the Pacific. And that has been based in Singapore. It's now moved to Colombo and to Trincomalee, which is also in Sri Lanka. And the Japanese want to get rid of that fleet because if they can destroy the British fleet in the Indian Ocean in a way that they'd aimed to destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, it will give them a lot more freedom of action to go from Malaya into Burma and potentially into India, which is their ultimate goal. So the Japanese come up with a plan to attack Colombo and Trincomalee, attack the British naval bases in Sri Lanka, which is quite similar to the attack on Pearl Harbor, basically. It's most of the same aircraft carriers that were used at Pearl Harbor, except for one which has gone to be repaired. The others all sail into the Indian Ocean, and the plan is they will make a surprise attack on the Eastern Fleet, the Royal Navy Eastern Fleet, as it lies at anchor in Colombo, and then the war will be over in the Indian Ocean and the Japanese can do what they like. Fortunately for the British, there are messages being transmitted on JN-25 and other systems about the Japanese plans, and these are being read by FECB in Colombo. And what is unusual about this is quite often routinely the Japanese use code names for places. They don't write in a message, we're going to attack Colombo. They use letter codes or things. So you can see in a message that they're planning an attack, but you don't necessarily know where they're attacking. On this one occasion, they make a mistake, or one of their signals operators makes a mistake, and he sends a message where instead of using the code phrase, he spells out the name Colombo actually in a message. The way the Japanese spell words in their messages is they use the kana alphabet, which is a Japanese sort of syllabic alphabet. And the operator uses the phrases ko, ro, om, bo in the message, which is equivalent to Colombo. And there's a British codebreaker called George Kernock, who's in Colombo at the time, and this message comes across his desk, and you can imagine his alarm when he reads a message saying that the town he's sitting in is about to be attacked. So this is passed on to Admiral Somerville, who's in charge of the Royal Navy, and the majority of the fleet are able to evacuate from Colombo and from Trincomalee and go to a previously secret base they've established in the Maldives. And they go there, and on Easter Sunday of 1942, Japanese carriers arrive and a massive air attack is made on Colombo. It causes a lot of civilian damage, and it's not great if you're in Colombo, but its main purpose was to attack the British fleet. And rather similarly to how the US carriers were absent from Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked Pearl, the British fleet is absent from Colombo when they attack Colombo. And whereas it was largely by chance that the American carriers weren't in Pearl Harbor, the British fleet isn't in Colombo quite specifically because George Kernock has been able to warn them. This message has been intercepted. And it's one of the few times in sort of signals intelligence history that you can say one message had a really massive impact. So often we say that it's aggregation of hundreds or thousands of messages that give you really important intelligence. On this occasion, literally reading one message was enough to tip everybody off. So, and that it's partly luck and it's partly a mistake by the Japanese operator sending the message in the first place, but it's sometimes it's these small things that are the tipping points in really major events. And the consequence of that is that the Royal Navy's fleet in the Indian Ocean remains in being. So the Japanese aren't able to take control of the Indian Ocean. They do go on to invade Burma, and indeed they get right up to the Indian border. So the war continues to go quite badly for the British in that theatre, but you can imagine how much worse it would have been if the fleet had been destroyed at Easter 1942.
Filmed under fire, these are the first pictures of America's great naval victory in the Pacific. Army, Navy, and Marine planes, cooperating with the fleet, surprise a Jap invasion force sent to capture strategic Midway Island, stepping stone to Hawaii and the North American continent. U.S. planes roaring to the attack amid a rain of anti-aircraft fire.
In 1942, the U.S. Navy was working against the mainline Japanese Navy code, which we called JN-25. There were two centers, particularly, one in Washington, D.C., and one at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The cryptanalytic unit at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, made some breakthroughs and began to read portions of messages in early 1942. As their stock of Japanese words in the code book increased, they began to get inklings of Japanese operations across the Pacific. In early spring 1942, the U.S. intercepted, and the code-breaking unit in Hawaii decrypted and read a message that showed the Japanese were planning a major thrust through the Central Pacific. This was to be centered on the island of Midway. But the messages made it clear this was not another territorial grab by the Japanese. It was to be a trap for the American fleet. The American fleet had not been fully damaged by the Japanese. It was striking back at the Japanese, and the high command in Tokyo had ordered its senior admiral in the Pacific to this time finish off the American fleet. So the Japanese admiral, Yamamoto Isoroku, laid an elaborate trap. He was going to launch what looked like an all-out attack on Midway Island. Yamamoto was very familiar with Americans, and he knew they saw Midway as the last defense point before Hawaii itself. He knew that they would have to respond if the Japanese attacked that island. But when the American fleet sortied out of Hawaii, got into Pacific waters, there would be a second Japanese strike force that would come up from the south, get in behind the Americans more or less, and the two Japanese strike forces would crush the Americans between them. It was a brilliant plan, and there really was just one flaw in it. Thanks to the codebreakers in Hawaii, the American admiral in charge of defending Hawaii and operations across the Pacific read the Japanese plan in advance. He knew it was a trap. And by reading all the Japanese messages, he learned in absolute detail what ships the Japanese had in each arm of their strike forces and when they were to arrive in the theater of war. The American fleet was still outnumbered by the Japanese fleet at this time, but because our Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Japanese plan, he was able to position his smaller aircraft carrier-based fleet properly before the Japanese got to the attack points. So he was ready for them, and he was able to take control of the battle because he knew their plan. It was a desperate fight, and I admit the Americans had a good deal of good fortune when the Japanese made some blunders in their tactical operations. But good luck is one thing, but what made the difference was the good intelligence that enabled the American commanders to take advantage of the good luck. And the Japanese fleet never recovered from the smashing they got at Midway Island. Up to that point, the Japanese had always been on the offense in the war. After that, with only a few exceptions, they were on the defense. I emphasize intelligence did not win the war. Intelligence enabled the fighting forces from the American Navy to show what they could do. And the sacrifice of these fighting men was what made the difference. But without this key intelligence, the American forces would have fought just as bravely, just as hard, but they'd have lost.
Meanwhile, the British position is further undermined when German U-boats in the Atlantic begin to use Enigma with a new layer of encryption, an additional rotor.
Another problem that confronts Bletchley Park in 1942 is what's referred to as the shark blackout. From the summer of 1941, Bletchley's been able to read German naval Enigma with increasing success. But in the autumn of 1941, they start to get hints that the German Navy is going to change its procedures and that they've actually developed the M4 Enigma, which is an Enigma machine that instead of having 3 rotors in it to create the encryption, has a 4th rotor. That rotor isn't exactly the same as the other 3. It's a very specific piece of kit. But what it does is it makes the encryption vastly more complicated. So the existing setup that the British have with 3 rotor bombs and their other techniques doesn't mean that they can't break 4 rotor Enigma, but it would be very, very difficult. And so they start to get wind of this in the autumn of 1941, and then in February 1942, the worst happens as far as they're concerned, and M4 is introduced for all of the German U-boats that are operating in the Atlantic, so attacking British convoys coming from America, which is in many ways the most important naval theatre of the war. And Bletchley, from February onwards, is basically unable to read any U-boat messages from the Atlantic. And that puts an enormous pressure on naval intelligence. Prior to that, they've been able to read the messages. It doesn't prevent Bletchley from doing useful work. They're still relying on direction finding and identifying particular submarines from their operators and technical radio fingerprinting. So there's still stuff they can do. But how the Operational Intelligence Centre at the Admiralty describe it is they said the picture went out of focus. It was much harder to tell in detail what was happening in the Atlantic.
In October 1942, The situation dramatically improves for the British, and they are able to break shark with a priceless tool.
And that happens because of an event thousands of miles away from the Atlantic. It actually happens in the Eastern Mediterranean, just off Suez. A German U-boat, U-559, was forced to the surface by a group of British destroyers and was actually captured on the surface, and British sailors were able to get on board and into the signals room, and they recovered crucial code books associated with the Enigma machine. And they make their way back to Bletchley Park, and they've been able to start breaking messages again, and something like 15 U-boats in the Atlantic were identified and their locations confirmed within a fortnight. So that shows the power of capturing these code books. And it's really a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. The British start to get the upper hand in that campaign. And it's not only in the Atlantic that the tide of war is turning. In North Africa, 1942 has been a terrible year for the British. The Germans under Rommel almost reached Cairo. But again in October 1942, you have the Battle of El Alamein, and that puts the Germans on the back foot. And from there on, the British are able to begin to advance again, and the war has turned a corner. Meanwhile, on the Russian front, at the end of 1942, you have the Battle of Stalingrad. And this was a huge offensive that the Germans launched, but it was a complete disaster for them. The Sixth Army is completely destroyed. And that's widely taken as the turning point in the Russian campaign, the point when the Germans stop winning in Russia and start losing. So that, taken together with events in North Africa and with the Pacific, with Midway that we've talked about, where the Americans have really turned the corner against the Japanese, 1942 marks the worst point of the war for the Allies, but also the point at which things start to get better. And from this point on, they can start thinking about how to win rather than how not to lose, if you like.
So defeats for the Allies really was the story of the first year or a little over a year of World War II. But by mid-1942, British and American strength was rising. The intelligence people overall and the SIGINT people in particular now had their proverbial act together. They were providing good information in all theaters of war that would guide commanders. And SIGINT would prove to be a big difference in operations against these two very powerful enemies. And it's around mid-1942 that we see the payoff from the early hesitant cooperative effort and the arrangements that were made subsequently.
This is reflected in a speech by Churchill in Parliament, where he makes one of his classic Churchillian puns, if you like, and it's become very famous as a consequence. What he actually said was, "This is not the end, this is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning."
In the next episode, we explore the story of the bomb machines.
Both the Army and the Navy in the United States had about 5,000 women working in cryptology.
And the Americans working at Bletchley Park.
Americans would probably have slightly better rations, we think, than the British, and there's some really American items on this menu.
They give a really good insight into the fun that they had when they weren't working.
They were sort of the vanguard of the American invasion of the British Isles.